Hello, hello, everyone. We're back with Shane Jack Schaefer. We're going to be in chapter 5 pretty soon, but real quick, let's look backwards and just see that what happened was we got Shane now is going to be a farmer on Joe's house and basically farmlands because Joe asked him if he'd stay and he said, I'm in, I'm in. He went up into town to get some clothes and so forth. And clearly people are talking about this guy, that's for sure. Bob learns that he's got a gun, a pretty nice looking gun, this Colt, this black Colt. And he's kind of curious, well, why isn't he wearing it, given that most people wear their guns at this time? So a little bit strange things going on. And then at the end there, Joe, dad, tells Bob, don't go get into liking Shane too much, which is also kind of strange because why not? This guy seems like an awesome guy. Why would you want to tell your son, don't like him too much? So a lot of interesting things going on. And we're just going to hop right in to the next chapter, 5. I'll get a name for it a little bit later. Oh, here's a picture of it. The weeks went rocking past, and soon it did not seem possible that there had ever been a time when Shane was not with us. He and father worked together more like partners than boss and hired man. The amount they could get through in a day was a marvel. The ditching father had reckoned would take him most of the summer was done in less than a month. The loft was finished and the first cutting of alfalfa stowed away. We would have enough fodder, it's kind of like animal food, to carry a few more young steers through the winter for fattening next summer. So father rode out of the valley and all the way to the ranch where he worked once and came back herding a half dozen more. He was gone 2 days. He came back to find that Shane, while he was gone, had knocked out the end of the corral and posted a new section, making it half again as big. Now we can really get going next year, Shane said, as father sat on his horse staring at the corral like he could not quite believe what he saw. We ought to get enough hay off that new field to help us carry 40 head. Woo, said father. So we can get going? And we ought to get enough hay. He was pleased as he could because he was scowling at Shane the way he did at me when he was tickled silly over something I had done and did not want to let on that he was. He jumped off his horse and hurried up to the house where mother was standing on the porch. Marion, he demanded right off, waving at the crowd. Whose idea was that? Well, she said. Shane suggested it. Then she added slyly, but I told him to go ahead. That's right. Shane had come up beside him. She rode me like she had spurs to get it done by today. Kind of a present. It's your wedding anniversary. Well, I'll be damned, said father. So it is. He stared foolishly at one and then the other of them. With Shane there watching, he hopped on the porch and gave mother a kiss. I was embarrassed for him and I turned away and hopped about a foot myself. Hey, those steers are running away. The grown folks had forgotten about them. All 6 were wandering up the road, struggling and separated. Shane, that soft-spoken man, let out a whoop you might have heard halfway to town and ran to father's horse, putting his hands on the saddle and vaulting into it. He fairly lifted the horse into a gallop in one leap, and that old cow pony of father's lit out after those steers like it was fun. By the time father reached the corral gate, Shane had the runaways in a compact bunch and patting back a trot. He dropped them through the gateway neat as pie. He was tall and straight in the saddle the few seconds it took father to close the gate. He and the horse were blowing a bit, and both of them were perky and proud. It's been 10 years, he said, since I did anything like that. Father grinned at him. Shane, if I didn't know better, I'd say you were a faker. There's still a lot of kid in you. The first real smile I'd seen yet flashed across Shane's face. Maybe there is at that. I think that was the happiest summer of my life. The only shadow over our valley, the recurrent trouble between Fletcher and us homesteaders, seemed to have faded away. Fletcher himself was gone most of those months. He had gone to Fort Bennett in Dakota and even on east to Washington, so we heard, trying to get a contract to supply beef to the Indian agent at Standing Rock, the Big Sioux reservation over beyond the Black Hills. Except for his foreman, Morgan, and several surly older men, His hands were young, easygoing cowboys who made a lot of noise in town once in a while, but rarely did any harm, and even then only in high spirits. We liked them when Fletcher was not there driving them into harassing us in constant shrewd ways. Now, with him away, they kept to the other side of the river and did not bother us. Sometimes, riding in sight on the other bank, they might even wave to us in their rollicking fashion. So they're kind of lively and, rowdy. Until Shane came, they had been my heroes. Father, of course, was special all to himself. There could never be any quite to match him. I wanted to be like him, just as he was. But first, I wanted, as he had done, to ride the range, to have my own string of ponies and take part in an all brand roundup and in a big cattle drive and dash into strange towns with just a rollicking crew and with the season's pay jingling in my pockets. Now I was not so sure. I wanted more and more to be like Shane, like the man I imagined he was in the past, fenced off so securely. I had to imagine most of it. He would never speak of it, not in any way at all. Even his name remained mysterious. Just Shane, nothing else. We never knew whether that was his first name or last name, or indeed any name that came from his family. Call me Shane, he said, and that was all he ever said. But I conjured up all manner of adventures for him, not tied to any particular time or place, seeing him as a slim and a dark and dashing figure, coolly passing through perils that would overcome a lesser man. I would listen in what was closely akin to worship while my two men, Father and Shane, argued long and amiably about the cattle business. They would wrangle over methods of feeding and bringing steers up to top weight, but they were agreed that controlled breeding was better than open range running and that improvement of stock was needed, even if that meant spending big money on imported bulls. And they would speculate about the chances of a railroad spur ever reaching the valley so you could ship direct without thinning good meat off your cattle driving them to market. I want to note here that there's such a difference between this type of approach with Shane and Joe, just chatting about, hey, how can we improve what we've got going here? How can we sell more cattle? How can we grow them more? Versus there's some people that are just set in their old ways and they will continue to do it the exact same way their father did it. And then their father's father did it. And they just keep doing the same thing. And clearly Joe and Shane are not those type. They're tough guys, but they're also thinkers. They're thinking about how can we improve our lot? It was plain that Shane was beginning to enjoy living with us and working the place. Little by little, the tension in him was fading out. He was still alert and watchful, in sync with that unfailing awareness of everything about him. I came to realize that this was inherent in him, not learned or acquired, simply a part of his natural being. But the sharp extra edge of conscious alertness, almost of expectancy of some unknown trouble always waiting, was wearing away. Quick question for you guys out there. Bob is saying it's a part of him, a part of his nature. I wonder about that and I question that. Is it really a part of Shane's nature? Like he was born this way? Like as an infant, he just kind of developed like, oh, I'm going to be super aware for the rest of my life, much more than any other human being out there or other human beings. Or did he maybe have a natural inclination and then develop this along the way because of experience? So I'm curious what you think. I kind of probably gave my own views away by being sarcastic there about the baby. But anyways, what do you think about that? Yet why was he sometimes so strange and stricken in his own secret bitterness? Like the time I was playing with a gun Mr. Grafton gave me, an old Frontier model Colt with a cracked barrel someone had turned in at the store. I'd rigged the holster out of a torn chunk of oilcloth and a belt rope. I was stalking around near the barn, whirling every few steps to pick off a skulking Indian when I saw Shane watching me from the barn door. I stopped short, thinking of that beautiful gun under his bunk and afraid he would make fun of me and my sorry old broken pistol. Instead, he looked gravely at me. How many you knocked over so far, Bob? Could I ever repay the man? My gun was a shiny new weapon, my hand steady as a rocket as I drew a bead on another one. That makes 7. Indians or Timberwolves? Indians, big ones. Better leave a few for the other scouts. he said gently. It wouldn't do to make them jealous. And look here, Bob, you're not doing that quite right. He sat down on an upturned crate and beckoned me over. Your holster's too low. Don't let it drag full arm's length. Have it just below the hip so that the grip is about halfway between your wrist and elbow when the arm's hanging limp. You can take the gun then as your hand's coming up and there's still room to clear the holster without having to lift the gun too high. Gosh, oh gory, is that the way the real gunfighters do? Queer light flickered in his eyes and was gone. No, not all of them. Most have their own tricks. One likes his shoulder holster. Another packs his gun in his pants belt. Some carry two guns, but that's a show-off stunt and a waste of weight. One's enough if you know how to use it. I've seen a man have a tight holster with an open end and fastened on a little swivel belt. He didn't have to pull the gun then. Just swung up the barrel and blazed away from the hip. That's mighty fast for close work and a big target, but it's not certain past 10 or 15 paces. No good at all for putting your shot right where you want it. The way I'm telling you is as good as any and better than most. And another thing, he reached and took the gun. Suddenly, as for the first time, I was aware of his hands. They were broad and strong, but not heavy and fleshy like father's. The fingers were long and square on the ends. It was funny how, touching the gun, the hands seemed to have an intelligence all their own, a sure movement that needed no guidance of thought. His right hand closed around the grip, and you knew at once it was doing what it had been created for. He hefted the old gun, letting it lie loosely in the hand. Then the fingers tightened and the thumb toyed with the hammer, testing the play of it. While I gaped at him, he tossed it swiftly in the air and caught it in his left hand, and in the instant of catching, it nestled snugly into this hand too. He tossed it again, high this time and spinning end over end, and as it came down, his right hand flicked forward and took it. The forefinger slipped through the trigger guard and the gun spun, coming up into firing position in one unbroken motion. With him, that old pistol seemed alive, not an inanimate and rusty metal object, but an extension of the man himself. If it's speed you're after, Bob, don't split the move into parts. Don't pull, cock, aim, and fire. Slip back the hammer as you bring the gun up and squeeze the trigger the second it's up level. How do you aim it then? How do you get a sight on it? No need to. Learn to hold it so the barrel's right in line with the fingers if they were straight out. You won't have to waste time bringing it high to take a sight. Just point it, low and quick and easy, like pointing a finger. Like pointing a finger. As the words came, he was doing it. The old gun was bearing on some target over the corral, and the hammer was clicking at the empty cylinder. Then the hand around the gun whitened, and the fingers slowly opened, and the gun fell to the ground. The hand sank to his side, stiff and awkward. He raised his head, and the mouth was a bitter gash in his face. His eyes were fastened on the mountains climbing in the distance. Shane, what's the matter? He did not hear me. He was back somewhere along the dark trail of the past. He took a deep breath, and I could see the effort run through him as he dragged himself into the present and a realization of a boy staring at him. He beckoned to me to pick up the gun. When I did, he leaned forward and spoke earnestly. Listen, Bob, a gun is just a tool, no better and no worse than any other tool. A shovel, or an axe, or a saddle, or a stove, or anything. Think of it always that way. A gun is as good and as bad as the man who carries it. Remember that. He stood up and strode off into the fields, and I knew he wanted to be alone. I remember what he said all right, tucked away unforgettably in my mind. But in those days, I remembered more the way he handled the gun and the advice he gave me about using it. I would practice with it and think of the time when I could have one that would really shoot. And then the summer was over. School began again, and the days were growing shorter, and the first cutting edge of cold was creeping down from the mountains. And that's it. That was a quick chapter, or at least it felt like a quick chapter. First thing I would say is, right off the bat, rewind this video a few minutes or a minute, a few 30 seconds, so I don't know how much, and go back to that point that Shane talked with Bob about the gun. He says, a gun is as good and as bad as the man who carries it. That's a line right there, man. That's a heavy line. I wonder, do you think that's true or not? Are guns bad in themselves, or are guns as good and as bad as the man who carries it? And when he says man, he means man, woman, whoever is carrying that thing. Very interesting, particularly today because of all the chaos, man, the horror and just tragedy at schools with mass shootings, and not just mass shootings, but all sorts of killings that go on around the world, but in America, because that's where I'm at. I'm in South Florida. All sorts of gang violence, killings in major cities, that type of things that utilize guns. So, and then on the other end, police officers use guns to protect our lives. And so is the military. And so do sometimes private citizens. So it's an interesting commentary on guns in this book. Curious your thoughts on it. Anywho, let's do this. Let us do Shane's face when he kind of like gets transported back in time and now wants to share this guidance or insight of his own with Bob. So he's rather serious at this moment. I try to get into his voice during the reading, but sometimes a little bit challenging. So here, I'm hoping to get his face as good as possible if this were really Shane chatting with Bob. So. All right. That was my serious Shane face. I'm curious what yours is and how much you think it represents the real deal Shane. So good chatting with you guys as always. Send any questions my way if you have them or comments and so forth. And I'll see you next week. Enjoy.